Gerd Gigerenzer encouraged us to look a little bit closer at the real world, and at my talk today, I'm going to really get my hands dirty. So we're going into the real world, more real, I think, than most of the examples that you gave during your talk. The topic of today is intractability and the challenge of intractability. And coming from cognitive science, as I do, intractability is generally seen as bad news for pretty simple reasons. That is, if you can't practically do it, then, well, it just can't be done, and then you need to find another way to solve the problems then. It is an assumption that practical solvability matters, and that it matters also for notions such as rationality. And I'm getting a little worried here. Okay, so I'm back. So this is really then practical rationality, I would assume. Thomas Sturm mentioned the dictum ought implies can as something that pops up when you start talking about intractability. And I would agree with, I think, him, that this is a sentiment that also is applicable to rationality, so that we want a concept of rationality that's actually applicable to agents of various kinds, and preferably also to real human beings. Now, of course, when you talk about ought implies can, the meaning of can becomes important, because what is it that we want to allow to limit the sort of oughts that we can demand of people? So one common suggestion is laws of physics. It doesn't make sense to require someone to do something that is physically impossible to do. Another one that has come up is that if it's not computable within polynomial time, then, well, there is not much use in requiring that that is something that an agent should do. But the can that I will focus on today is of a sort of lower magnitude, and that is cognitive capacities. So what sort of things can we actually do, and what sort of implications does that have for a concept of rationality? So I'm basically going to argue that we should, as Gerd Gigerenzer suggests, we should look at what people are doing in order to construct what should be done, maybe. But then if that's an argument you want to make, you also want to take a close look at what people are actually doing. Now, before everybody here starts to think that I'm completely crazy, I just want to say that when you talk about rationality, you have to be a little bit careful about what type of rationality you're talking about, or on what level you're putting the discussion. So I generally like to think about it that there are 3 different levels, at least, at which the rationality concept can be understood. And the first level is what I would call the ideal level, where we're talking about ideal rational agents, and we have descriptions, there are several, of course, of the rules that these agents ought to follow in order to behave rationally. And usually these ideal agents are endowed with a number of very handy properties, such as infinitely fast computational capacities, complete information, and infinite sensitivity. And you can play around with these, but normally for just basically practical reasons, if you want to do decision theory, you're going to have to assume some of these things, because otherwise you will not really end up anywhere, basically. Okay? Now, of course, I mean, as we all know, probably no one in this room has any of these properties, so that's sort of like a no-brainer. And that means that there is another level at which we can also talk about rationality. And I usually think of this as the guidelines level. So this is a description of how actual agents ought to behave, right? And generally the idea is, I don't think it's necessarily so, but generally the idea is that we can take certain ideas or concepts from the ideal models of rationality and say that these should apply also to real people or to real agents, and then we can go on and see if that's actually possible, if that's actually what they do. So it's a sort of implementable rationality, and of course it comes with a number of assumptions, such that preferences can be measured, or that we can actually estimate what beliefs people have, and so forth and so on, right? And you have to buy that if you want to buy the guidelines approach. And this is something that most psychological research, at least in the area of judgment and decision making, would be happy to make. So we're thinking that in some way we can have an opinion about the rationality of what real people are doing in real situations. And one early sort of suggestion in this line comes from Ward Edwards already in 1954. I know the earlier ones, but I kind of like this quote, where he says, in connection to a discussion of economic man, that it's easy for a psychologist to point out that an economic man who has the properties discussed above, and that was complete information and infinite sensitivity and rationality, is very unlike a real man. And then he says, this isn't fair. The most useful thing to do with a theory is not to criticize its assumptions, but rather to test its theorems. Now, I'm not entirely sure I actually agree with that sentiment. I think it's also quite useful to criticize assumptions. But what he's saying here is that the theorems can be tested, and that they can be tested using psychological methods, right? It's an assumption. So he assumes that the translation can be made. And this assumption is relatively common. So if you look at the heuristics and biases program, that's an assumption they're making. If you look at dual process theories, that's an assumption they're making. And also, I hope you don't disagree, when people work in ecological rationality, what they're saying is that there is some understanding of rationality that can be applied to what real people are doing. Now, what that guidelines rationality is, how it should be understood and how we should evaluate it, there are lots of different opinions there. But that it can be done and that it's interesting to do it is something that I think most people take for granted. Now, of course, then the question becomes what these guidelines look like, right? And the problem here, of course, becomes that things that might be completely merged on the ideal level will become different because you can interpret them in different ways when you try to translate it into things that you actually want to require people to do, right? And if you look at the literature within judgment and decision-making, you can find at least 2 different sets of suggestions as to what these guidelines should look like. And I hope I got it right. I think in the previous talk you talked about it as internal consistency and as ecological rationality. Was it internal consistency you used, Gerd? I forgot. Internal consistency for the coherence account? Yeah. So that would be that you require that people follow a set of procedural rules. So for instance, do not break the conjunction rule would be one example. Whereas on the other side, you'd have rather a focus on the actual sort of real-life success of using particular ways of making decisions. And you use this as a sort of yardstick for what a sensible or rational thing to do is, basically. Now, of course, there's also a third level, and I think it's important to mention it, and that is the descriptive level. Because when you construct guidelines, you also construct potential descriptions of how real agents actually behave. And you can then go out and see whether people actually behave in accordance with these guidelines, and the results will, of course, be different depending on what set of guidelines that you go out and test, obviously. So there is a strong connection here between the descriptive theory and the guidelines level. Now, there are calls for purely descriptive theories of judgment and decision-making that do not use sort of guidelines or rationality approaches. I'm kind of skeptical as to whether that's actually doable, but I know it's an interesting idea, and I haven't really made up my mind what I think about them yet. But today, my focus will be on guidelines, okay? And the reason that I focus on guidelines is that I think that they're really important. And I think actually that they're probably much more important than anything that we can do within ideal rational models. And the reason for this is that it's in real life behavior where things happen, right? So when you use guidelines, you can categorize actual behavior as being rational, or if you don't like that word, sensible or not. And you can also steer behavior in appropriate directions, right? So you can actually do things and not just talk about the meaning of words. And I think that's kind of important. So I'm firmly on the guidelines side here, okay? Because in some contexts, we actually want to judge what people are doing, okay? So, I mean, I'm all for using the principle of charity, but there are instances where we actually want to be able to say that this is not a good way of doing things, this might be a better way of doing things, right? And those instances are important because these are instances that actually might help you to accomplish something and to change things. So, as I said previously, this is then, of course, closely related to the argument of what implies can. And as I said previously, the question then is what this can actually means. And an important question then here, of course, becomes who the agent is. Who is it that we're talking about? So who is the agent, right? So we had one set of superheroes, or super babies, I think it was yesterday, that have all these nice properties that you don't find in real human beings. We have a set of agents constructed in these sorts of settings. This is another set of agents that I'm not going to talk about, but I think that Iris will mention later on today. So these are artificial agents, right? And then here is the most common agent investigated in studies on judgment and decision making. That's a university student. And a very large portion of the studies made on human decision making, or actually human psychology at all, has been made on students because it's a handy sample, and this is of course something that you could worry about. So one could almost say that there is some sort of taxonomy of minds here. And now I have to be a little bit careful because this is going to sound like I'm ordering them in order of sort of how good they are, but I'll take that for the time being. So at the top we have these sort of logically omniscient beings, and then we have the best available minds, be they human or artificial. We have academics with varying training, we have experts, we have students, and then we also have the man or the woman on the street. And I do hope that you see that that's the sorting hat from Harry Potter. I'm kind of proud of that picture, okay? So what I'm not even mentioning here are developmental and cultural differences, right? And I'm not going to say anything about that today. I'm just going to sweep that under the carpet. But I'm happy to get back to that in the discussion and say that I should have addressed it, but I don't really have anything to say about that yet, basically. Now, in relation to intractability, I think one thing that I would like to say is that this seems to be an issue mostly for the top agents in this list, right? Well, not the very top one, but the ones below that. Because as you go lower, the relevance of considerations of intractability seem to become less relevant because the constraints are of a completely different nature. Now, I might be wrong here, and I'd be happy to get it into the discussion. But what I would like to propose is that we look at instances of real-life decision-making made by real ordinary people and see what the constraints here are, and if there is some way to actually talk about the behavior here as being in accordance with rationality guidelines or not, okay? So is there some sort of end point to the what implies can? What's the lowest sort of can that we would want our theories to apply to, basically? And that's sort of the thought experiment, and also based on real data, that I'm going to propose to you today. So this sort of end point then would be sort of a lowest level where we would want to consider things to be guidelines rational. And this sort of endpoint would require two things. We need a description of the agent, right? Because we need to know what the cognitive capabilities are. But we also need a description of the task, because obviously the type of cognitive capacities that you use when you're choosing breakfast will be kind of different from the cognitive capacities that you do when you're trying to decide how to handle a cancer screening result or something like that, right? I mean, and it seems sensible that there would be a difference in the sort of cognitive effort that we put into these two tasks, right? So the task description also becomes quite important. So the sort of endpoint then that we would need will need a number of things in order to work. So first of all, we need some way to say something about whether people are behaving sensibly or not. And this way can then be related to guidelines or proposed rationality guidelines. We also need some sort of variability of performance, because otherwise there is really no point in applying rationality guidelines. But I think my intuition is that what we need is an everyday task with a reasonably good performance, where we have a behavior that in a situation that we would normally not dream of questioning, but that we sometimes would like to point to and say, but actually what you did here, that was kind of strange, although most people actually behave fine in that situation. I think that would be a suitable endpoint. Now, as it happens, I have spent quite some time in a different context, different research context, looking at people going grocery shopping, okay? I've done it myself also, but I've also spent quite some research time trying to understand what's going on in this situation. And I'm going to toy with the idea that this could be a suitable endpoint. It might be the wrong one, but let's just bear with me. Let's look at this example, see what happens here, and see how this actually relates to possible rationality guidelines, guideline rationality or not, okay? Just as like, think of it as a thought example, okay? And the question then becomes, is this a suitable example? Well, it is a rather tricky situation that people are actually facing, right? We have a very large number of options and an even larger number of attributes. I mean, supermarkets are completely overfilled with different things to choose between. And we also know that people spend very little attention on each individual option available to them and very little time on the decisions. In addition, and this becomes important because the research I'm going to talk about is based using mobile eye tracking, it's a very, very complex visual environment. So it's difficult to find the things that you're looking for, basically because it's so cluttered, okay? And also we have a practical problem in the setting of this conference, and that is that the task of growing grocery shopping maybe is not the best example of epistemic rationality. And I'll just admit that and apologize, but at least I will be talking about rationality and intractability, so you'll have to pay my fee anyway, okay? On the plus side, I would like to say that in the supermarket, most options to choose between are actually fairly okay for people, okay? Not just in the sense that there are rarely poisonous things among their cans of tomatoes, but also they actually, I mean, they are made to more or less meet the preferences of people, even though there, of course, is variation here. And also, we're in a situation where consumers actually have experience. And I think this is a good thing because this allows them to actually perform at some sort of reasonable baseline level. We can't expect people to perform guidelines rationally in a situation that they've never encountered before because they wouldn't know what to do, right? So they've had the time to develop some sort of strategies in order to handle this situation. Now, just to get you a feeling for the type of data that I'm basing these results on, so what my colleagues and I have done, again, in a completely different context, actually, I'm just using it here, is to use mobile eye tracking to see what people visually attend to when they go grocery shopping. So basically, you fit people with a pair of rather ugly glasses, the black ones you can see there, and these glasses contain cameras. One camera that films the scene in front of you, and one or two cameras, two in this case, that films your eyes, okay? And then results from these two are merged so that you can see what people attend to in the visual field in front of them, basically, okay? And there are some things that are useful to know that you might know already, but for instance, the area in which you can see sharply and actually get sort of substantial information with respect to, say, options and attributes is about the size of your thumbnail when you hold out your hand like this. So it's a very limited area which you can actually see sharply. And then you have, of course, a larger visual field. You can see movements, etc., etc. But if you want to get, for instance, written information, then this area is the only one that will actually get you that information, basically. So just to get you a feel for it, I thought I'd show you a film. So this is a person that we've asked to do ordinary shopping wearing these glasses, but just for a matter of practicality, we also asked this person to buy a package of pasta and a package of cereal, and we reimbursed them for that, but they actually got to keep the things afterwards and eat them. So this red dot that you see here is where the attention is focused. And now I think she is approaching, the cereal section. And you can see that she's looking at some of the options. And then eventually she will just basically make a choice. So that's what the data looks like. It's not terribly interesting, but sometimes fun. And the task that I will focus on today is based on one, just to not confuse you, is based on one particular category, pasta, and it's based in one particular study where we unfortunately ended up having quite a few student participants because the supermarket we visited was in a student-heavy area. But we've looked at other settings as well, okay? So what can we say about buying pasta then, okay? So one thing that we can say that one of the shelves, the shelf that we were focusing on, contained 82 different types of pasta. And this is ignoring, for instance, lasagna and spaghetti because they were on a different shelf, okay? These pasta options were, of course, displayed multiply on the shelf, right? So we had 213 phasings, different packages, but some of them were sort of identical, okay? And this is here where you can see that there's a student population because on average they buy pasta 30 times a year, which is quite a lot actually, I think. And if you look at the attention that they spend, so the active time looking at something where they actually can get some information about it, you'd find that they look at about 40% of the options. And this is actually a rather high number compared to most of our other studies. But still, they're not even seeing in a sort of conscious way more than half of the available options on the shelf. And the total dwell time, so this total time actively looking at one of these options, is about 30 seconds. And again, this is actually a rather high number compared to our previous studies, but I blame it on the student population. I think they were trying to be careful and impress us, okay? Now, of course, that's all fine and dandy, but can you say something about guidelines rationality in this context? I mean, this seems to be completely messy and difficult and complicated, and how on earth are you going to say if people are doing the right or the wrong thing here? I mean, that's a reasonable question to ask. And what I'm trying to do here to say that, yeah, maybe you can start look at these situations in this way, and that might have implications for how we want to formulate guidelines. So that's basically sort of like where I'm aiming at. But intuitively, when you look at them, and this is of course not valid, but intuitively when you look at them, you sometimes really want to say that they're irrational, just based on your own sort of personal point of view. So we had people there that went shopping, admitted to going shopping 4 times a day, and they bought the most awful things. But I mean, that might suit them and their life circumstances, so of course I can't pass judgment even though I really want to. You can go grocery shopping 4 times a day if you want to, even though I think there are more efficient ways of using your time. Okay, so how then are we to determine whether they're behaving sensibly or not in this sort of situation? Are they adapted decision makers or not? I mean, how should we know? And it seems that there are 2 different ways in one which could look at this, okay? So one thing one could look at is whether they're actually meeting their goals. And another thing is to look at whether they're actually doing this in an efficient enough manner. Okay, these are 2 sorts of questions that we can ask. How to answer them is of course another issue, but they can be asked, okay? So let me start. Was there a question? No, just a movement. Good. So let me start with the goals. And I have to apologize because now I'm going to introduce a measurement that is truly awful. And it pains me to describe it, but it's the only one that was practically possible in this situation, okay? So sometimes you have to do things that hurt you because they're the only ones available. So what we did was that we asked them, after they, sometimes before and sometimes after they had completed their shopping, what they thought was important when they were going shopping. So this is actually for cereal, I see, but for pasta then we would ask them, so how important is a particular brand to you? How important is the price to you? How important is nutritional value to you? Country of origin, and so on and so forth and so on. So we got the weights that they assigned these different attributes out of them. And of course, I agree, it's an awful measurement for many reasons. And one of them being that we all know that what people say that they want and what they actually do are quite different things, right? And this is also well established within marketing and so on and so forth. So it is, I admit, it's a bad measurement. And it gets worse, okay? Because what we then did was that we computed something that we called option quality. So what we did was that we used the information available in each package, and we weighted this information according to the weights that the consumers had given us. And then we computed the average. So we had a weighted additive measure of how well this package fit the stated preferences of the individual, okay? And it's bound to be bad, but hopefully it captures something at least, okay? And this was then again normalized, so we have a range between 0 and 1, so 1 being a perfect fit to the preferences and 0 being an imperfect fit, to say the least. And what we then did was that so of course, just remember, then one and the same package would have a different option quality depending on who the consumer is, right? So a good package of pasta for me could be a really bad one for Iris, for instance, and that would be fine, okay? So we have different option qualities for different individuals. Again, awful measurement, I agree, I'm just saying mea culpa here, but really practically it was the only thing that we could do. You can't have people make arbitrary choices between all possible options on the shelf and expect them to agree to do that, because that would take forever, basically. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that if we look at what they're buying, we see that they're actually doing quite well using this measure. So the average option quality of all products was about 0.5, which is fairly decent, I think. But the average option quality of the products chosen was 0.7. And given the complexity of the situation, right, the enormous amount of alternatives available and the amount of information that they did not attend to at all, I think this is a pretty good result, also because I think our measurement isn't a perfect measurement of their preferences, right? But anyway, we have a difference here, it's stable, we can trust it, and I think it's relatively relatively impressive, actually. I'm not going into the statistical details here because I don't think it really matters for what I'm trying to do here today. So on one account, we could say that they're actually doing quite well in this situation. Another question that one can do is, of course, how they're actually going about to do this, right? So are they using an efficient method in order to find the pasta packages? Well, in one sense, obviously, right? They're using a limited amount of time, and the choice they end up with is pretty good. But of course, we would still want to ask questions about the process. So how do they handle this rich environment in order to get what they want, okay? Now, we don't have experimental control. We don't have anything like that. What we have is access to their visual process, and we want to see how they're using the visual environment in order to reach their goals, basically, okay? So some ideas that you could play with in relation to this are, for instance, that you require a certain or a suitable amount of cognitive labor out of participants. That's probably a really bad idea, right? Because if you can do well with a lower amount of cognitive effort, that isn't a bad thing, right? So it would require that people think carefully about something that they can do easily is just stupid, right? But what we could do is to think about the as I said previously, whether they're actually using their attention in an effective way. And there is other studies. Now, this is not using visual. It actually is using visual attention in some cases. Doesn't matter. Sorry, I lost track here. So one way in which we could do this is by being inspired by a study that was done in 2016 by Oud and associates, where he claimed to have demonstrated an irrational time allocation in decision making. And I'm just going to talk you through this experiment because I think it's interesting. I'm not so sure that I think it demonstrates irrationality, but I think it's interesting anyway, and it actually inspired us to do the analysis that we then ended up doing. So what Oud and colleagues did was that they used a much better preference measurement than we did and found out exactly what people felt about different candy bars, okay? You see the value of psychology here, right? This is something that really, he's an economics actually, but you can see we really want to know what people think about candy bars, right? And then they gave them a number of sequential choices in which they got to choose between different candy bars, right? And the experiment was, one part of the experiment was set up so that they had a limited amount of time to make a number of choices, to go through a choice set. How much time they spent on each choice was up to the individual, but the limit of time was set such that it was impossible to complete all the choices before time ran out, okay? And once time ran out, the computer would make the choices for you instead, okay? And it would make it at random, okay? Now what they did was that they constructed two sets of pairs of chocolate bars, basically. So they had an easy high stake set and they had a hard low stake set. So the easy high stake set would be a choice between two candy bars that differed a lot in how much people liked them. So say that Thomas, you really hate Kit Kat and you love Mars bars, right? So the choice between these two is, it's fairly easy for you, but if you get it wrong and you end up being rewarded with the Kit Kat instead of the Mars bars, then you're not going to be happy, right? Because you like the Mars bars much more and you dislike the Kit Kat, okay? So, oh yeah, I forgot to say, so they were rewarded by a randomly drawn thing that either they or the computer had chosen. On the other hand, maybe you think that Mars bars and Snickers are equally good, okay? Now this is a difficult choice because you feel about the same thing about the two of them, but whichever you choose doesn't really matter because you'll be about equally happy about the outcome nevertheless, right? Okay? And what then happened is that they made people go through all of these choices and they looked at what choices people actually spent the most time at. And as it turns out, the easy high-stake choices were given less attention and the hard low-stakes choices were giving more attention and a longer period of time, okay? So people spent more time on the choices where the outcome didn't really matter for them because they would be happy, well, equally happy, regardless of what the choice was. And this, then, Oud and company argue, is an example of an irrational allocation of time. And they also demonstrate that if you give people a time constraint for each individual task that speeds them up, they actually do much better. So if you restrict the time they have for each choice, they're doing better because they're not deliberating as much over the hard, low-stake choices, basically. So is this some sort of idea that could be applicable also to the supermarket then? Well, it would have to be different, but what we can think about is whether people are actually effectively distributing their cognitive effort or their visual attention in the supermarket setting. And one thing that you have to remember about when you go to the supermarket is that you're actually in a kind of hostile environment, okay? Because everybody, marketers, designers, store managers, they want you to look at specific things. And in particular, they want you to look at the things that have a high margin, right? Because they know that if you look at it, you're more likely to buy it. If you don't look at it, you're less likely to buy it, okay? So they are competing for your attention, and they're using all sorts of knowledge, be it informal or formal, about how to use color, contrast, placement, phasing eyes, whatever, using faces and eyes, whatever is drawing attention in order to get your attention on a particular option, okay? And there are ways to compute what is visually attention drawing. It's called saliency. And basically you use the knowledge that you have about lower level visual sensitivity, what your visual system is sensitive to and what it would automatically respond to compute what areas of a picture, say, that would be particularly attention drawing. So this is saliency. And we use this on our data. And we try to see what most draw participants' attention, if it was the visual saliency or if it was options with high option quality. Okay? And what we found was this. Again, I'm not going to give you the details of the analysis because I don't think it's relevant in the current context. But certainly people's attention is drawn to visually salient options. Okay? Anything else would be very surprising. But it's also the case that people's attention is drawn to options with a high option quality. And there is a rather strong interaction between the two. So if you have a visually salient option and then with a low option quality and a visual salient option with a high option quality, people will look much more at the visually salient option with a high option quality. And if you have two options with equally high option quality, whereas one of them is visually salient, they will look much more at the visually salient option. And this graph demonstrates, ooh, that's a small text. It's the probability of a dwell. We also have total dwell time, doesn't matter, but the likelihood that people will look at something when it's predicted by option quality and by saliency, and you can see the interaction between the two. So what then does this mean? Well, it seems that the consumers actually both identify and choose products that fit their preferences, okay, if you accept my crappy preference measurement. And they do so in an efficient way. And this even though they ignore more than half of the options and under extreme limits of processing and processing time. Okay, so they're doing fairly well in this sort of dirty, everyday, complicated task, right? Which is very different from both small worlds and traditional experimental tasks where you just answer a number of questions with paper and pencil, okay? So I would say that it is possible to look at both outcomes and processes and make some sort of judgment as to whether people are doing well or not. And they are doing well in this case, I would argue. And the question then, of course, becomes how this is related to guidelines or to ideal rational models. I mean, does it make sense to make a connection up here? And I'm hoping that it is, actually, because otherwise, yeah, I think it's kind of pointless. Well, there seems to be a relation, at least to guidelines, right? I mean, in particular, the success-oriented guidelines seem to work well because people mostly get what they want, right? Things that they actually want to buy. And this is in a rather hostile environment. And it also seems that one could look at the process and have some sort of process-oriented guideline in order to estimate what people are doing, and that is that they appear to allocate their attention and time in a sensible way. Now, these are, of course, judgments like that. I don't have any strict sort of criteria or cutoff points or anything like that. That is something that could be discussed, how one would do it. But I would want to point out that the type of claims about what's sensible here or not is of a very different type than the type of recommendation that you would give to people, say, try to avoid intransitive preferences or something like that, right? I mean, it's the quality of the recommendations that you would give to people here, such as utilize the visual features of your environment in order to identify what you want, is of a very different type, basically. Now, of course, I mean, the topic today was intractability. And of course, I think that you could come back and say that, well, if you look at the perceptual processes, I mean, and the possible computations that are going on behind there, issues that concern intractability can certainly arise, again, depending on how you think this plays out. But the things that I have observed seem to say that people are doing, the way people are approaching this problem is of a kind of a different type. So the question is, who should we actually focus on in order to understand human rationality, right? So who is most likely to represent the bulk of human decision making, okay? And I have my answer clear. And I think that there is actually some sort of frequency argument to be made here. It would make sense that the guidelines we have are applicable to the situations that are very common and that are encountered a lot of the time, for two reasons. First of all, because these decisions matter, right? So we want our guidelines to be applicable to them. And secondly, because if anything, how you handle these sort of situations, the ones that you commonly encounter, is probably likely to actually influence also how you handle other types of situations that are of a more sort of demanding character, right? Because it's in the supermarket you get your decision-making training. It's not when you handle very rare, I don't know, information about your health or something like that. Hopefully you don't get a positive mammography screen very often in your life, right? But you go pasta shopping far more often. So this is likely to shape the way you make decisions much more actually than those rare cases. So basically I've just been playing around today, and I admit that. But what I wanted to say is that I would argue that it is possible to construct guidelines that are applicable to everyday human behavior. And talking about heuristics would be one way, but I think there are other ways as well. And whether my way of doing it is correct or not, I don't know. It's difficult to construct guidelines in this sort of setting because there is so much we don't know. It's completely uncontrolled. But I would argue that it's worthwhile to continue trying, because if we can't talk about these sorts of situations in a way that relates to guidelines and relates to ideals of decision making, then what are we to use them for, basically? That would be my question. I think that looking at the endpoints also, and not just at the higher level decisions, is an important challenge, basically. So the real superhero, or the real super babe, in my opinion, is actually this person here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. First, I can provide the missing link in your talk.
Great,
between intractability and your paper. So as you pointed out, there are probably thousands of items to buy in a supermarket. Axiomatic decision theory has a basic axiom called completeness. That means that you have a preference for either A over B or B over A, but no preference is not allowed. That often it's seen as a kind of innocuous, trivial thing. But you can easily see in the supermarket you can do it, because then you would have in the millions of comparisons to do, and even if you could do it, you would spend every day in your supermarket. So it's another kind of intractability. So you need something different. And you say that you analyze the process, and here I disagree.
Yeah, I can
you
see
haven't
what you mean.
really
No.
analyzed the process.
Yep.
You just claimed.
Yeah, I agree.
So why not studying the process rather than asking them about the weight? So I think you were much too conservative that you could do. So how do they make? Do they rely on name recognition? Do they form a consideration set? Or just go by habit through this thing, always buy the same thing? That would be the one next step. And also very interesting, analyze the design of the supermarket.
Yep.
Supermarkets are designed in a very specific way. The typical supermarket has first fresh vegetables and fruits and also bread to get this out of the way, that people can think about the other things they really don't want to buy. And so the design of the supermarket is very well studied. And so it's not just individual heuristics, but the supermarket, it's the interaction between the environment and so the ecological rationality of the supermarket would be the next step.
Yeah. I agree with both, and actually we have done some work in both of these areas, but with respect to looking at the process, it's actually very difficult in this sort of setting, because the type of data that you have is kind of hard to relate to the type of theories that exist. What we can say, for instance, is that the number of times that people look back and forth between options is very limited. So that would indicate some sort of comparison. But there are such sort of visual comparisons, and those are most likely to occur in the time spent in front of the shelf where you're most likely to sort of make an active decision. So from the moment that you first look at the thing that you end up buying and the last time you look at this thing that you end up buying. So there are some process indications there, but I would love to talk more to you about it, because it's really hard to actually make sense of this data in relation to the types of heuristics and strategies that are usually discussed in the literature, because it's so different. But it needs to be done, and I would love to do it. And with respect to the supermarket environment, that's certainly true. There's lots of knowledge about this. And actually, what we can find is also, and I didn't mention it, is that people actually quite smartly use that. Okay? So for instance, they would know how to direct their attention. So if you want something cheap, you look at the lower shelves. If you want something expensive, you look at the top of the middle shelf, right? So they're sensitive to the design of the environment, and they certainly have knowledge about that. So that's certainly true. I agree with what you're saying, and we're trying to do it.
Thanks, that was fascinating, and I have a lot of questions, but given your answer to Gerd, I guess one question that I want to ask you is, can't you ask the people how they make their decisions? Can't you ask them sort of how, I know that you can't trust what they say necessarily, but it might be a starting point, and then comparing whether you see similar answers appearing again and again, and whether that matches the way their eyes have been actually moving.
Yeah. So in principle, you could do that. My feeling is that people don't really know. And when you talk to them about it, they would say like, yeah, I usually get this, or something like that. So I think people generally tend to talk about themselves as being formed by habits, but actually if you look at the literature, you can see that there are ways to sway people that they are sensitive to. So you, for instance, you go in with the grocery list and you come out with many more items that were on the grocery list, right? So there's something that makes you deviate from your plan and add things to the grocery list, for instance. So there's data like that. It's a huge literature. I don't know all of it, but it's certainly possible. Another limitation is, of course, that this is actually, you can't see it, but this is actually very sort of time-expensive research to do, because there is no good automatic system that will fit what's on the video screen to categories, right? So we have to analyze by hand each option people are looking at in the screen, because the systems that exist aren't trustworthy for mobile eye tracking because of parallax errors and because of lack of good recognition systems and things like that. Hopefully that will change, and I think that will very much change the research that can be done here. So having more than 120 participants, for instance, it's just so painful that you want to commit suicide after a while, because it requires a lot of painstaking manual coding, and there is a limit to how much you can ask a PhD student to do, even if you don't think so.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about the connections between the various parts of your talk. So you started out talking about these different ways of thinking about rationality, and there were the very idealized ways, and then you were emphasizing and encouraging us to focus on, you know, the person on the street way, which might come apart. But then, basically, I mean, what we've seen is a decision-making process that works pretty well. It's pretty efficient, but you know, you didn't sort of look in detail at exactly what the mechanisms were by which people were doing it. So I was just wondering, I mean, you know, for all, I'm not suggesting this is the case, but it seems like for all that we've seen so far, these people are operating like ideal Bayesian agents. I mean, it didn't seem like there was anything that they've done that suggests otherwise. And in fact, when you were figuring out what their preferences were, you were not using some sort of lexicographic ordering. You were assuming that they cared about multiple factors. And so I was just wondering if you thought there was anything about these sorts of studies that suggested that the kinds of processes people were doing were not these sort of highly theoretical processes. I mean, not of course consciously, but whether they could be modeled as agents that are operating according to some of these very idealized models.
Well, how do you, so as I said, in most of the studies we've done, people look at less than a third. Even notice less than a third of the things that are available. Now, that might be fine. I know that you wouldn't require that someone takes all information into account, but how would you motivate looking at that particular third or not, right? I mean, they have some very quick way of estimating how to do that, which I think would be kind of, you might come up with a smart way to sort of explain what's going on there, but I think it's kind of hard to fit that with some sort of Bayesian model, right? I mean, so how do you, you need a cutoff point. You need to sort of, and also, I think that, it might be compatible. I don't have a problem with that, really. I mean, the reason I used this awful option quality measurement was basically because you need some sort of yardstick to compare to, and that is one that is relatively, it's not uncontroversial, but everybody can understand it and relate to it, and then you can have opinions about it, but you can relate to it. And I think it says something about how you, something about how well they meet their goals, although it's probably not the true measurement at all, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that basically what I'm saying is that the processes that we need to take into account are of a different, it's not like take in information, weigh it, look at, it's more of a perceptual, and of course that could then be modeled in a Bayesian way, and I guess that's fine, but if you want to give people recommendations, the recommendations you should give them are probably not of the type that make sure that you think of costs or probabilities or things like that. It would be a different type of thing. So it's just that the thing that you need to say in order to communicate with people in this situation is of a very different type. So regardless of what's actually is underlying what's going on here, the thing that you want to say to them, I think, has to be very different. So telling them to avoid intransitive preferences, for instance, would be kind of pointless, I think.
But could you give an example of the sort of thing that you would say to them? Mm-hmm. Because it just sounds like it's a very complex process that people are doing, and probably it's largely subconscious. And so what kinds of things would we say to people that you think would be helpful?
Don't try to outsmart the store, but use the features that are there to your advantage. Would be one thing, for instance.
Okay.
That'd be one thing I could say.
So thank you very much for your interesting talk. Maybe this question is related to the previous discussion, and maybe you actually asked the question that I wanted to ask you. So let's see how it goes. So let me grant you for now your measure, right? You already said, of course I'm a psychologist too, so I was reminded of Nisbet and Ross's
well,
work.
If you come up with a better one, I'd love to.
I have none. I have none, but maybe we can discuss later. So I'm going to grant that, and I agree that it's kind of puzzling, surprising that they do pretty well in the sense that what they choose according to this measure. So putting aside whether or not it maybe means they have some insight, maybe they do have some insight actually in what they do, and this is why they can report on it. But in your experiment, you focus on choosing one thing. Was either cereal boxes or pasta. But of course, when people shop, they shop for a lot of things. And I wanted to do a thought experiment and then hear your ideas on how you think this will scale. So do you think that if people not only go for pasta, but they go for full, cart, as I do in the weekend, I have 2 kids, well, it's like completely full.
And it doesn't really matter, but actually they do. So they do the ordinary grocery shopping, it's just that we pay them extra to buy pasta.
Okay, and do they score for all items or only for the pasta one?
What do you mean by score?
Like how much they care about different things. So do you know that with all the items they are happy?
No, not all of them, because that would be...
it's too much work,
too much time.
So this is why we
focus on 3,
Yeah, so this is why it's a thought experiment. So do you think it will scale that if you were able to ask them for all the items, that indeed, on average, they're pretty happy, really their choices are good according to their own criteria? If so, how is this possible given that they are ignoring so much information?
That's a good question.
Right? So the information is because you assess the quality relative to options they don't consider. They don't even look at them. Yet their choice is good in terms of quality relative to that set. How is that possible?
They're good. They have found some efficient way of doing this. I mean, you also have to think about that they have experience, right? So it's not a completely novel task. So probably they have had time to form an opinion on what to look for and what not to look for. And this will also, I think, be part of the explanation of the strong interaction between saliency and option quality. So what you can do is that you can't stop something from visually tugging at your system. That's a strange way of putting it, but I think you understand what I mean. But what you can do is that if you can quickly identify it and suppress it, you can then ignore it. So say that you hate Italian pasta, right? Which would be a weird thing to do, but you hate Italian pasta. You never want to buy Italian pasta. There will be a huge segment on the pasta shelf with blue packages. You will quickly see them, and then you will turn away from those packages and not look at them anymore. And you have very quickly discarded a very large part of the option set, right?
So, but it also means that some of the peripheral vision may come into, so not just where people look, but they may see, oh, this is where, so I don't need any, vegetables today, this is the vegetable area, I'm going to just pass.
Works, but it doesn't give you any information. So if you want to read something, you need to fixate on it, right? Or if you want to recognize it like properly. But you can see, in your periphery, okay, color vision isn't in the periphery, but you can see movement in the very periphery, and you have color vision like on a larger portion of your in your visual field. So you can, these sorts of things you can see and use, right? But to actually see that that's farfalla or that's actually this or that you can't do unless you fixate on it.
Okay, so then if I may still push this point, that if indeed this kind of decision is intractable, and I don't know because it would require me to model. Actually, I'm interested in collaborating on this question if you are.
I have tons of data. You can have it.
Okay, but let's say that is intractable, then. So then it remains but they do actually make choices according to classically rational criteria. There's a puzzle about how they can do that. You agree?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'll return to this later.
I'm telling you, she's good.
Thanks. So I would be especially interested to see how what kind of relationship there is between people who do relatively well or poorly in your grocery shopping situation in your own studies, because presumably some people don't do as well as others.
Definitely.
And how, whether the good and the bad performers, whether there's some relationship between how people perform according to you and how people would perform if you evaluated them according to more like classical rationality criteria. And so for one, I know there is at least one very large study, I think in the US, that tracked people's grocery shopping over, I think, more than a year, or at least a year, and tried to basically put numbers on how closely they matched expected utility. And people were not perfectly expected utility maximizers in their grocery shopping, but they were able to break down people into groups and say what demographic groups depart more from expected utility and so forth. And so maybe it would be difficult for you to connect your studies with that kind of really complicated data, but there's a much easier thing which you could do, which would be to just do small manipulations in the grocery store and see whether the people who perform poorly, how you evaluate it, are, for example, violating transitivity in their pasta choices. So it wouldn't take too much for you to do that, to set things up so that they have pairwise choices, and just see if the people who look to be stupid shoppers according to you are violating transitivity. Or you could offer them pasta lotteries and see if they're going to violate independence, and that would be really interesting, because then you would be able to say look, those traditional criteria look like they map onto something in the real world, or they don't. So is that something you've thought about or would do?
So there are some studies, not looking at grocery shopping, but Fischoff and Van de Bruyn and some other people at CMU, Andrew Parker, they have done some large scale studies where they basically made some sort of minimal, they wouldn't call it that, thankfully, but a minimal rationality testing like framing effects, and I mean sort of minimal versions of sort of traditional judgment and decision-making tasks, like in the vein of heuristics and biases, and give people a score on this, and then relate it to real-life outcomes. So this was done for, I think, youths at risk in the Pittsburgh area, where they had access to real data, such as time in prison and abortions and things like that. And also for, I think, which is kind of a lovely contrast, people involved in charity organizations in the Pittsburgh area. And then it was just self-rated decision outcomes. So would they get fines at the library, or, you know, things like that. And then they looked at correlations between these two. Now, they're very weak, obviously, but there is work in that respect. So that's probably, if you're interested in that relationship, that's work that you could look at. And you can have opinions about how it's done and the correlations and things like that, but I think that's sort of what you're asking for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to email you some references if you want to. Mm-hmm.
The theoretical one, which is, I know it's very distant from what you're actually interested in, but he was saying, you know, well, we can't use polynomial, non-polynomial time algorithms and so on, but actually all those complexity theory notions are, I mean, they have to do with the behavior of these algorithms in the infinite limit, and so they tell you nothing about how the algorithms behave on you know, small numbers, sure. Basically, so that in a way, you know, one needs a different kind of complexity theory if we're interested in real life situations where, you know, you have very low finite.
You're probably
bounds.
right. Yeah.
The practical thought was, I mean, if you're interested in process, I wonder if you've thought about looking at online shopping, because, you know, there you, I mean, much more cheaply you get a record of what's going on, and, you know, and you have more information about the process, because, for example, you know what search terms people have been using. So it might be that it would cast some more light on at least the way people are thinking in that situation, which is it's a situation that now a lot of people are very used to. So it's not some kind of you know, artificial experimental situation.
Sure, and we're actually doing that as well. I think that it comes still with a cost. Now, for this particular study, we ended up having quite a lot of students, depending on, because we accidentally choose a store that was close to student population, and we should have seen that coming. But for the other studies we've done, we actually have the advantage of a relatively random sample of individuals, and they do behave quite differently. So I think problem with this, which I'm also doing, so I would agree with you, is that you get a specific subset of the population that would be willing to participate in that type of experiments and would use it. So I think it would probably change the idea you have about how people do. But still, what's interesting, and there is actually very little, I mean, there are lots of research on it, but it's not particularly good, to be honest, and there's very little on how people actually approach these sort of internet services and things like that. And one thing that's interesting is that people seem to take their internal supermarket with them, and then they use that when they shop groceries online as well. So you'd sort of like, you won't, even if you always buy the same milk, you won't just search for that milk and then put it in your basket, but you would go to the dairy section of the web page, and then you would look through the list of milks until you find your milk. So you're sort of like, yeah, you're sort of moving around in your sort of fake little supermarket, but on the web page. So, which is kind of interesting. So, I think that still the sort of prototypical situation for people is the supermarket, and they just bring it with them to the internet shopping. But that will probably change with time. But it will be easier, but it would also be a bit more boring, I think.
Quick question, and I might be confused about what you said, but the Mars bar example, I seem to remember you said something like when there was a big difference in your preferences, it took you less time than if there was a small difference. It struck me that would be like rational insofar as the one case just is easier than the other case.
Yeah.
Right.
But using random at that case would be quite effective, right? Because there is a small difference in the value that you have, right? So if you have a limited amount of time and the difference between the options isn't very big, then I mean, it may be more difficult, but it would be better for you to then just pick one, whatever. So that's the idea behind the irrational time allocation.
Right. Any other questions? We still have time. If not, sorry. Who was first?
It's just another quick one, but when you had this measure and the performance of people in the pasta task was 0.69, which is better than the 0.51 that would come from random choice or the average of the products.
I guess, I didn't think about it that way, but yeah, you could see it like that.
Did you also calculate for each person what the maximum, I guess the maximum is 1, and is that right? If they could get a maximum of a score of 1 if they chose the perfect...
Yeah, it was normalized, so that would be different. I mean, so for each individual it's normalized, so 1 is the maximum for that person, right?
So everybody could have scored a 1.0, and so that's not really that great, is it?
You don't think so? I think it's very good.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay,
well, it depends how many products there are on the shelf within their reach in between the score they got and...
Yeah, I could pull that out, but I don't remember. But I would say that, I mean, what you get is, I mean, it's most of the time, it's normally distributed, right? So most of the products will be 0.5, basically. I mean, I don't know exactly, but it's normally distributed. Yes, most of the products would be sort of in the middle with respect to option quality for you, right? So it's kind of difficult to find the ones that really, the 1.1 is difficult to find, right? Because there will be much fewer of products like that. Right? So you have to take that into consideration as well. And then I think that 0.7 is actually, if you think about the normal distribution, I think it's pretty good.
Okay.
I have mostly comment on some of the questions.
Good. Do you want to come up here?
No, thanks. Some questions asked whether that isn't these ladies here isn't the ideal Bayesian, or someone asked whether it isn't expected utility theory. I just would like to remember that even Savage, who is credited as the father of Bayesian decision theory, said that already planning a picnic is outside of his theory. So in Savage's opinion, including mine, these questions makes no sense. It's like asking, aren't we God? This is not, you can't be a utility maximizer in this world of uncertainty. It's not even a starter. Sorry, but that's also my opinion. I think we have not learned to understand the limits of Bayesian decision theory and its small worlds, at least from its own originator. Second comment, intractability is, you're right, yeah, it's in the infinite, yeah, but I think she has a good case here. I don't know how many items in a shopping center are, maybe assume there are 2,000. Huh?
I think it's 60,000 is the average American supermarket.
Okay. Let's just take a small one, 2,000. Then you would have to compare about 2 million, make comparisons in order to create an order. And that's, even if you can do it, it's just not worth it. It's very clear that would be a very stupid theory. And
I wasn't challenging that.
yeah,
what
yeah,
one really needs is some kind of complexity theory that gives you information.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
numbers below some finite
yeah,
band. I mean, that's
yeah.
and
Mhm.
I mean, polynomial versus exponential. I mean, they're kind of as it were mathematical substitutes for those, but they're not really lots of interest.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
these
Yeah. And if there would be only a few items, then it could be done. So at the beginning of of the internet, there were only 10 or so internet sites. But today it's a large number, and there is no way to do this. Last comment, you asked about online shopping. I think that would be a good example here. And there is quite a large amount of research by John Hauser and also by some of our research group looking at online shopping, like smartphones. And then there are hundreds or thousands of smartphones, and there's no way anymore to go through all of them. And John Hauser has looked at the heuristics that people use. And you can do this by eye tracking, I think much more precise on the screen.
Yeah, definitely.
And also by what they are looking up. And he concludes that basically there is a consideration set first, and then there is a kind of lexicographic structure similar to take the best. And that's what people can do. And I think that going into process models would be your next step.
Yeah. So John Hauser, you said, I'm happy
She
to look
says
that up.
yes.
Yeah. I do.
I'll listen to your next talk.
Good. I'll invite you.
John Hauser
Yeah.
in MIT.
Yeah.